Good evening to you and a warm welcome if you're just joining. We start with this story. The Correctional Services Department says convicted murderer Donovan Moodley has not been approved for parole, but that the consideration process is underway. He was handed a life sentence after pleading guilty to the 2004 kidnapping and murder of Bond University student Leigh Matthews. The final decision now rests with the National Council for Correctional Services and the Minister, Pieter Groenewald. Matthews' parents have opposed Moodley's release, saying the parole process is tantamount to secondary trauma.
We will remember that Donovan Moodley was given a life sentence. Therefore, a process for life is different from people sentenced to a determined period. Determined period is a number of years, but a lifer is someone that after having served the minimum required time, the profile must go through what we then call a case management committee. From there, it moves to Correctional Supervision and Parole Board. From the board, it then goes to the National Council for Correctional Services, who eventually will then make a recommendation to the minister to make a decision. So we are not even halfway through the process. It's unfortunate that those who were part of the process today were quick to make that pronouncement, and that is prematurely because we are not at a stage where we can then say this is a decision, because we are not at the decision-making process as yet.
All right, let's try and take this conversation further now, and we get more reaction. We're joined by Leigh Matthews' father, Rob, and we're also joined by the family's attorney, Tania Koen. To both of you, my thanks for being here this evening. Tania, I understand you were part of that conversation, so I'd like to start with you before I go to Mr. Matthews. What do you know? You've heard the Correctional Services spokesperson saying it's not true that he has been given the green light, at least at this early stage. What do you know?
All right, so obviously Advocate Annette Hofmeyer and I were there today to make representations on behalf of Rob and Sharon and their daughter Karen, and because they just didn't see their way clear to be emotionally traumatized again and go into a small confined space and face Donovan Moodley, who had killed their daughter. So we are familiar with the process. The process is that the parole board makes a recommendation to the National Council of Correctional Services, and they in turn make a recommendation to the minister. So who broke the news, I don't know, because we had just arrived home at Rob and Sharon's house to depart the news to them in person. We didn't want to do it over the phone when my phone rang and it was the press calling me to say that they had heard. So certainly we deny that we had in any way or form contacted the media, because we know the process. We know it's just a recommendation at this point in time.
But just that knowledge that the parole board has at least given the green light in this early process, has that happened before, or is today very different from previous experiences?
Yeah. Today was the first time that they did give the green light, as you so nicely put it. So that was a surprise to us, because our view is that he has still not been rehabilitated. And the reason why we say that, for instance, last year, 2024, he launched an urgent application to court to be transferred back from Leeuwkop to where he had come from, making allegations that there was somebody there that wanted to kill him. And the state then, in their opposing papers, put before court evidence that that was not true, because the person that he was alleging wanted to kill him wasn't even at Leeuwkop. And furthermore, that previously, when he laid those charges, he pointed the finger to other people who was found guilty of that. So it was proven to be a blatant lie. So it's very difficult to believe that such a person is rehabilitated. Yeah. And one of the most concerning things that he said today was that he had undertaken, if he was ever, caught by the police, he would take full responsibility and plead guilty, which he did. We concede that. Yeah. But he failed to mention that 4 years after that, He went as far as approaching the Constitutional Court to say he did not commit the murder, and he was pointing the fingers at 3 other people.
Yeah.
So he didn't explain that to the parole board today. So there was no transparency.
Let me come to you, Mr. Matthews. You have heard that today, for the very first time in his previous attempts to try and get parole, there is a nod. It's the early stages. There's a few more steps.
Yes.
But how does that make you feel as a family?
It stresses me because I think there's still a lot of unanswered questions. Parole is a process. The country has a system of parole, and we respect that. Excuse me, but there's a need for that process to be completed, that there's full disclosure, that the parolee is not a risk to society or to the victims, and that he's demonstrated, I beg your pardon, tangibly, that he has been rehabilitated,
Yeah.
and that independent parties, I beg your pardon, can confirm that rehabilitation. And Mr. Moodley, as far as we can see, with the limited documentation we have, has not met that criteria.
All right, I'm going to give you some time to just cleanse your throat there. Tania, let me come to you in the meantime. This whole process, as it has been described, where this is going to move to next is what is called the National Council for Correctional Services, and that the ultimate authority is the Minister of Correctional Services. How long is that process usually, do you know?
It's a very good question, because in the past it took several months, but with a new minister who's made a considerable effort to get the backlog up to date, I'm not sure how long it will take, but it will take a couple of months. Yes.
All right.
So our concern there, of course, is that part of the process is that the victims go to the parole board to go and make representations. Our view is that if Mr. Matthews and his wife and his daughter was of the opinion that Mr. Moodley was rehabilitated, they would have a different attitude to the matter. But the fact is, we're not being placed in possession of his profile. So we applied to be placed in possession of the profile, specifically the psychologist's report. But that was denied by Mr. Moodley. And that's part of the reason why we are saying if you are rehabilitated, then surely we'd have no problem to disclose your entire profile to the victims. And that's why there needs to be a change in the policy.
That refusal, Mr. Matthews,
Yes.
for access, for you as a family to access the psychologist's report about him, add to that what the history of this trial was, particularly what the judge said, and that is that he did not disclose fully as to whether or not he had other people that he worked with. That has convinced you to continue refusing
Yes.
his release on parole, am I right?
Yes, and it's more than just that. There was a psychologist's report that was at a previous parole hearing. And bearing in mind, he objected to the decisions of the parole board and took it on review. And that's why this process has endured so long. And every time that happens, there's secondary victimization, because then we become part of that. So in that psychologist's report, because he filed all that documentation for his court papers, we had access to that psychologist's report. We were astounded at the contradictions and lies that we found in that report. So much so that we took the psychologist on review at the HPCSA. And she appealed the decision because they found her guilty. She appealed the decision, and they found that we were credible witnesses, and that they upheld their decision that she did not exercise due diligence and care in the preparation of that report. Now, let's understand the psyche of the individual concerned.
Yeah.
His crime was one of convincing me that he was sincere, that he would release Leigh, if I paid him the money. And so from a convincing point of view, at that time in 2004, nothing's changed because he persuaded the psychologist, gave her examples of how he had changed. But if you dive deeper into that information, they were lies or mistruths or whichever way you'd like to. And those were statements that he made to the psychologist. And unfortunately, the psychologist took him at face value.
Yeah.
Now, we had a problem with that because the psychologist should understand who she's dealing with. So the report that came in today, we did not see that psychologist's report. We don't know what the new evaluation of Mr. Moodley is. We don't know.
Yeah.
Was it the same snow job that was given in the first place? Or is there really a change in his behavior? And I doubt that because this report was only some 2 years ago. I don't think you change in 2 years without some serious intervention at a very high level.
Today, when I was talking to the Correctional Services spokesperson, I centered my line of questioning to them around the victim impact statement, basically the family. And one of my questions to him was, will there come a time when the family's standpoint almost becomes, is basically sidestepped because you have refused time and time again, almost in a way as though to say, we as the authorities have tried to persuade you and have shown you certain behavior about this individual, and we're convinced that he is ready for release. And I want us to take a listen to part of what that response was, and we'll take the conversation a step further.
Donovan Moodley has appeared before the parole board on a number of occasions. And the victims, by law, must be invited to make representation. And they've done so throughout. In many cases, it is acceptable that the victims will express themselves, and some will say that they will prefer a person not to be placed out on parole. Some will even say that a person must die in prison. But the Correctional Services Act is clear in terms of what needs to happen, because every inmate, after having served the minimum required time, must be taken through the parole consideration process, which doesn't guarantee that the person will be placed out, but you have to be considered. So even with this particular case, the victims were invited and they've been participating fully. And they will even be kept informed in terms of where the process is, because from the, as I've said, from the parole board, it will now move to the National Council for Correctional Services, all the way until the minister makes his decision. Even at that particular point, the victims will still be informed before everyone else in terms of what has happened and the decision being taken, whether a person is placed out on parole or is recommended perhaps to undergo other programs.
All right, very briefly, before I come to you, Ms. Koen. Mr. Matthews, one of the issues or part of what he says there is that some families will say the person must die in jail. Where are you?
No, we're not one of those families. We're not one of those families.
But what is it that you specifically want around this individual?
So I'd like to make 2 points on that statement. The first point, this is technically the 4th hearing. The first one we were not invited to. So it really is a figment of somebody's imagination that victims are always invited. I can give you lots of examples where that hasn't happened. So that's the first problem. Yeah. The second problem in terms of the victim impact statement, we had one from ourselves, one from my daughter, and one from her psychologist. On an objective reading of those reports, I would find it very hard to believe that they were given serious consideration in the outcome of today's meeting.
Yeah.
And I would be very prepared to make that available so somebody at an objective basis can sit and evaluate and say, this man's got a point. Victims' rights need to be brought back, not to the extreme right, but somewhere in the center.
Yeah.
Let's give us in the center and give us information to make informed opinions and let us be comfortable. We're never going to bring Leigh back, but let us do something for the country that when people go on parole, they're deserving of parole, and that they don't go and reoffend and don't become a problem and more people become a statistic of some horrible information and horrible stats that we have in terms of crime in the country.
Ms. Koen, let's conclude with you. I use the word that at some point, families, the victims here, will be sidestepped by the authorities. It's not a nice word, but it perhaps is what happens with time, with the passage of time. It almost feels as if the feelings of the Matthews family is being sidestepped, despite their honest and the honest attempt to try and be convinced about this individual who's about to be released. If it does come to that point where this family's standpoint is sidestepped, what legally what recourse is available to them?
I just want to stress that both Rob and Sharon knows and accept that there will come a time that he will be released. The victim impact statement shouldn't only be a rubber stamp accepted by the parole board. They must pay proper consideration to all the facts that's placed before them, and that's where our problem lies. Because today, for instance, we place certain facts before the parole board which we feel they did not take into account.
Yeah.
So for the moment, we are considering our legal options the same way that Mr. Moodley asked the court to review the proceedings, the same way Rob and Sharon and Karen can also do that. But we're not there yet. We're considering our options, and we will, once we've discussed it with our advocate, Annette Hofmeyr, we will make our further decisions.
Mr. Matthews, any final words?
The focus at the moment is just on us as a family, and it makes me very sad because there are so many other people, victims of crime, that are not getting the exposure that is needed. The country needs to take all us victims of crime into account and allow them the opportunity to do what we've been able to do.
Yeah.
We're very privileged in being able to do this. There are so many other people that don't have that resource and that time and to be able to sit with a lawyer. That would be my dream and my wish. And hopefully the minister, if I may say that, could also hear what we're saying and reflect on it and say, we've got a point. Bring that pendulum back to the middle. So thank you very much for asking that question.
Rob Matthews, thank you very much for making time for us and once again telling us where you are as a family around this case. Tania Koen, let me thank you very much for your time as well.